Okay, so now part two of our hour. We begin with Connie McKoy, who I had a bio all ready to go here, and I've now lost my mind where we are. Here it is. So Connie McKoy is the Marion Stedman Covington Distinguished Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro School of Music, where she teaches undergraduate and graduate music education courses. Holds a PM in music education from Oberlin and an MM and PhD degree from UNC. With 19 years of public teaching experience as a general music teacher, choral director, and band assistant. Her research has been presented nationally and internationally and has focused on children's world music preferences, music teachers' cross-cultural competence, and culturally responsive pedagogy in music. She has been published in many, many places, and I have learned her work through my service with NAFE, the National Association of Music Education. And I know that you've worked with Ann Fennell, also in our school district, and so we welcome you, Dr. McKoy, here today. Please inspire us and show us how we can be better teachers for all of our children.
Thank you, Russ. I'm going to take just a second to do my screen share. Technology is always something that I want to make sure I've got going here before we get started. So give me just a second. Okay. So I'm hoping that everybody can hear me.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. So I've only got a limited amount of time here, so I'm going to jump right in, but I do want to mention that I think that the fact that we are facing challenges through teaching through a pandemic has actually forced us, especially in the area of arts education, to consider some new ways of engaging our students. And also because of the additional focus on Black Lives Matter throughout the summer, this has really brought this idea of inclusivity, about decentering whiteness, and perhaps even thoughts about the Western European canon to the forefront. And so I think it's really an opportunity that we have to engender change in the ways that we engage with our students in our respective arts programs. And I am very privileged to be able to speak to you today about this. There are three questions that I'd like you all to consider during the course of this presentation. The first one is, have you ever considered whether your arts education program affirms the role that culture plays in students' creative lives? The second question I would like to ask you to consider is whether students see their artistic selves reflected in your program, or whether your program implicitly sends messages about which genres of your discipline are valued and which ones aren't. And then finally, this is a question that I'm hoping I will be able to help answer for you during this presentation, and that is how principles of culturally responsive teaching can help you make connections with the creative spirit in all of your students. So before I get started, I always like to make sure that we're sort of on the same page when it comes to understanding what I mean when I say culture, when I talk about culture. And so I wanted to provide a definition by James Banks. I'll give you a second to read through it. While examples of culture in this presentation that I'll provide for you will often focus on race and ethnicity in terms of culturally responsive teaching, it's important to keep in mind that culture also encompasses other human characteristics such as gender, socioeconomic status, religion, language, attractional orientation, and other facets of human diversity. It's also important to understand that the ways in which each of these social identity characteristics intersect within an individual can result in that person being privileged in one context and marginalized in another. And it also can explain how groups of people can be marginalized through systems that create standards that are narrow and limited in terms of human diversity. So there's a definition of culture to get us started. But I also think it's important to understand a little bit about the timeline of development of culturally responsive teaching. So the timeline of development actually begins in 1995 with Gloria Ladson-Billings' theory of culturally relevant pedagogy. And Gloria is professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She was one of the first ones to theorize about how culture impacts student learning, and she approached it from an anthropological perspective. And Django Paris is one of the most recent theorists, and he has sort of extended the idea of culturally relevant pedagogy and has developed terminology of culturally sustaining pedagogy. Geneva Gay of the University of Washington, which is also where Django Paris is, introduced the term culturally responsive teaching in her book, Culturally Responsive Teaching, Theory, Research, and Practice. And although culturally relevant pedagogy and culturally responsive teaching are often used interchangeably, they are different, as is culturally sustaining pedagogy, though they're all related. So although time won't allow me to get into the differences in any detail, I should say that because Geneva Gay's ideas regarding culturally responsive teaching resonated with me as a music educator, they've served as a foundation of my own research and applications of this approach to teaching in music and indeed in arts education in general. And so hers are the ideas that I will be focusing on in this presentation. So what exactly is culturally responsive teaching? This is a definition that is often quoted in the literature from Geneva Gay, and it implies an ability to affirm diverse cultural characteristics, diverse perspectives, diverse experiences, and to use these multiple perceptions of reality in ways of knowing to form bridges to new learning and ideas. The second bullet to me is also one of the most important ones in that it teaches to and through student strengths. Oftentimes when we hear people talk about either multicultural education or issues of diversity or inclusiveness, they talk about it from a deficit perspective, that is, trying to bring in students to cultivate them so that we can make up for the deficits or the things that they lack. And one of the things that really strikes me about the ideas of culturally responsive teaching is that it actually acknowledges that students bring something to the table when it comes to education. Their culturally informed experiences and the knowledge that comes from that are aspects that should be utilized, should be valued in the learning and teaching process. So I've shared what culture is, at least one definition of culture, and what culturally responsive teaching is, but you might still be wondering why I believe culturally responsive teaching practices are important to us as arts educators. So I'm going to share a couple of those reasons as well. First of all, having reviewed the state teacher standards for every state in which I've presented on this topic, and I've presented in quite a few, without exception, each set of standards includes components relating to the ability to teach and assess diverse learners effectively. And as you all know, these are the 6 teacher standards for the state of California. And within all of the standards, there are components that address the need to consider student diversity, as well as their cultural experiences and backgrounds as related to that particular standard or that particular component within the standard. So being culturally responsive in our teaching has become part of how our effectiveness as teachers is evaluated. But even beyond the state's expectations of us professionally, I believe that the development of culturally responsive teaching is particularly salient for us as arts educators for two particular reasons. First of all, art forms are and have been intimately connected to culture, and they can be sources of identity for many cultural groups. And as I was listening to your superintendent speak just now, it seems as though this is something that's really a large part of our understanding about the value of arts education. But second of all, teaching in the arts without taking into account the various cultural meanings that a specific discipline might hold for students is to overlook an important point of reference, a point of reference from which new knowledge can be constructed and program relevance can either be established, maintained, or reestablished if it's been lost. Furthermore, if it's accurate to say that arts education functions as culture as much as it functions independently within a culture, then engagement with an art form is as much about the people who create it as it is about the form and function of the art itself. So this consideration leads me to the second of those three questions that I shared at the beginning. Can students see their artistic selves reflected in your program? Or does your program implicitly send messages about what genres of that discipline are valued and which ones aren't? So let's dig a little deeper into that question with this next activity. This is time for audience participation. Now, I just want you to know, I can't see the chat box myself, but I'm going to ask you to utilize it for this next activity. I am going to read some sentences, and these are the ones I'm going to read aloud. And when I read them, I want you to post the word you think should go in the blank. Now, these are statements that people often make. They're very common statements that are often made. So I'm going to ask the arts educators to respond to the first statement when I read it. I'm going to ask the music educators to respond to the second one in the chat box, post in the chat box when I read it. I'm going to ask the dance educators to post in the chat box when I read the third statement, and then I would like the theater and drama teachers to post when I read the last statement. So here we go. And again, I can't see the chat box, but we'll talk about it later. He's a great artist, but he is no blank. This is for the music educators. Listening to blank makes your baby smarter. This is for the dance educators. To be a great dancer, you must have a strong basis in blank. And then finally, for the theater educators, great literature begins with blank.
Connie, I'm just going to mention here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So to the right of the screen, there is a button there that says chat. At least I can see it.
Mm-hmm.
If you push on that chat button, then you might be able to see the chat.
I can't see it from my perspective.
Okay. I just wanted to check.
It's okay. I don't have to see it. It's fine.
Okay.
I'm assuming that people participated and wrote their answers in.
Do you want me to mention?
The next slide is the one where people can actually see what correspondence they have here with what was posted in the chat. So as you can see in each statement, these are the words that people typically use when they make these statements. And the missing words we might be reminded of having heard these statements ourselves from other people, maybe colleagues in our own areas. But what this exercise suggests is that our standards for excellence in arts disciplines are profoundly shaped and influenced by Western European assumptions regarding culture and cultural production. Schools tend to acknowledge and assign value to specific ways of knowing as opposed to others. This contributes to biases we may hold not only in terms of what styles and genres we value within our respective disciplines, but also how we view the creative and artistic capacities of the students we teach based on the extent to which their values correspond with ours or with the school's values. So all of this suggests a need for a more culturally responsive approach to our teaching in the arts. So I'd like to share some strategies based on 4 principles that my colleague Vicki Lynn from the University of Arkansas at Little Rock and I developed for addressing culturally responsive teaching in music, but which I know can be applied to all arts areas. These principles are: learn about yourself, learn about your students, create a supportive classroom environment, and making program and curricular choices that are culturally responsive. And I'd like to add here that the final slide of this presentation, I'll provide a link to a handout that includes some additional strategies and resources that you might find helpful, in addition to some of the ones I'll be sharing with you now. So as we look at the first principle, learning about yourself, this is a critical part of developing cross-cultural competence. The cross-cultural competence is the ability to function, communicate, and coexist effectively in settings with people who possess cultural knowledge and skills that are different from ours. Developing cross-cultural competence involves gaining a better understanding of how our cultural conditioning affects our beliefs, values, and attitudes, and then how our beliefs, values, and attitudes affect what and how we teach and how we view our students. Now, most of us like to believe we're fair and objective when working with students. But in reality, all of us are shaped by our experiences and cultural backgrounds, and we make assumptions based on those lived experiences. So learning about ourselves requires identifying areas of implicit bias that exist in our own thinking and checking ourselves to become more aware of when those areas come into play. We all hold unconscious or biased associations and evaluations about people, places, and things. So implicit bias is wired in our brains. And you'll notice in this definition of implicit bias, the highlighted portion of it is in an unconscious manner. And that's the part that makes it kind of challenging for us because we're often not aware of it. But I do have an activity that I often take people through when I'm presenting about this that will sort of give them sort of an initial understanding of how implicit bias functions. So this is another group participation kind of thing, but it doesn't involve the chat box, and you don't have to unmute yourself for this or anything. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read statements again, and at the end of the statement, there's an implication of a word that you should think of. So I want you to think of a word that should go at the end of the statement that I read. You can think of that word or you can say it out loud in your own space. Either way will work fine. So here we go. If I'm a stand-up comedian, I might tell you a blank. I don't drink Pepsi. I prefer blank. If there's a fire, there's likely to be blank. The white part of an egg is called a blank. Now, for some of you, unless you caught yourself, for that last statement, you might have come up with the word yolk. And there's a reason that that might have happened. It happens often because our brains are already processing a pattern and anticipating it. Our brains love to look for patterns. The pattern in this particular activity was rhyming words. After the first statement, it became clear that the next statement was a rhyming word. And the third statement was a rhyming word. And so the final statement had to be a rhyming word as well. But of course, we know the white part of an egg is the egg white. And just like if you completed the final statement by saying the word yolk, over time, your brain takes shortcuts in making certain associations and evaluations of people, places, and things over time. Sometimes those shortcuts are good, like the good feelings we automatically get and associate when we see people we love. But sometimes those shortcuts are not good, like when we unconsciously make instructional decisions that might privilege or marginalize certain groups of people over others, or certain genders over others, or certain types or genres of our specific arts area over others. Understanding ourselves and how our attitudes, experiences, and backgrounds inform who we are as teachers, that's the first step in developing cultural competence, which is necessary in being able to teach in a culturally responsive way. The second principle is learning about your students. In addition to learning about ourselves, cultural competence in the classroom requires that we get to know our students, learn about their goals and aspirations, including their musical goals and aspirations, and understanding what they bring to the classroom. All of us, including our students, are a reflection of the experiences we have within and beyond the classroom. We can't really know our students if we only focus on who they are as students. So some strategies you can employ to learn more about your students include things like using surveys or asking questions of your students to find out about their interests, their goals, their hobbies, and any of their artistic aspirations that they have. You can also use surveys to gather information about family backgrounds as they relate to your specific arts area. You might find that you're able to tap into the expertise of a culture bearer, as well as validate your students' heritage in the arts discipline that you engage with. Get to know about how your students spend leisure time outside of the classroom. Attending activities outside of the arts in which your students are involved can help you view your students in new ways. Indeed, attending arts activities outside of the classroom can also give you a different perspective about your student as related to your particular arts area. If you don't live in the same neighborhood as the students you teach and there are faculty and staff members in the school who do, talk with them about their neighborhood experiences. You might learn more about your students' cultural lives by speaking to people who are part of that community. Create opportunities for students to talk with you about their specific goals and aspirations in their preferred art form, as well as their non-arts related goals and aspirations. And these are just a few of the strategies that you might employ to get to know more facets of your students, because the relationships that we develop with our students are a critical part of the teaching and learning process. The third principle involves creating a supportive classroom environment. This involves establishing an environment where learners feel safe and where they feel seen. Some of the ways you can create a supportive environment include things like culturally responsive caring. Now, this involves holding affirming views of students from diverse backgrounds, as opposed to seeing racial and ethnic diversity as problems that have to be solved or inconveniences that must be tolerated. Creating a supportive classroom environment involves becoming effective in cross-cultural communication. This is where teachers understand that there are many culturally informed ways in which their students communicate both verbally and non-verbally. Sometimes, because we don't understand how students are communicating with one another, we misunderstand that communication. We think students are being disrespectful when they might not be. And so it's important to understand how students engage with one another and how they engage with others. It also requires us to sort of take a look at ourselves and ask ourselves, for example, whether we use vernacular phrases, humor, or sarcasm in a way that could be misunderstood by our students or which could offend our students. So we also need to think about these things and as well our body language and any of the nonverbal ways that we engage with each other. We know that body language is often very culturally related and associated. And so it's important for us to be cognizant of that. Particularly when we were in face-to-face environments, very critical. It might not be something that we can pick up on as easily if we were teaching in virtual environments, but I think it's still something important to think about. Having high expectations for all students is another important way to create a supportive classroom environment. And this involves believing that all of our students have a deep capacity for learning. I suspect that many of you are probably familiar with Victor Rios, an award-winning professor, author, former high school dropout, and a self-described juvenile delinquent. He believes that we should eliminate the term at risk, which we often find is utilized in education, because it stigmatizes students by framing teachers' perception toward the expectation of failure, which is a decidedly deficit-based approach. Rios has challenged educators to replace the term at risk with at promise, to recognize the potential inherent in all students. And indeed, a bill to remove this reference and replace the reference of at-risk youth and replace it with the term at-promise youth in California's educational and penal codes was approved by California Governor Gavin Newsom in October 2019. Having high expectations for all students means that students must be able to see the bigger picture of future possibilities that their students may not yet be able to envision. And then finally, learners thrive in an environment that supports a variety of learning styles and enables them to see themselves as knowledgeable contributors to the learning process. Being able to provide this kind of environment for our students means that we need to maybe take a critical look at the kinds of materials we use with them. What kinds of videos do we provide to the students and who's in those videos? What kind of posters, when we're back in our face-to-face environments, do you have in your classroom, and what do those posters reflect? Students need to be able to see themselves. And so you need to check your materials to determine whether or not they depict people of diverse backgrounds and abilities engaging within specific facets of your arts area and also engaging in different ways in your specific arts discipline. And finally, making program and curricular choices that are responsive to culture. This requires us to expand the content of instruction to include multiple cultural perspectives and multiple ways of knowing. It also takes into consideration the different ways students engage with facets of our disciplines beyond our classroom and rehearsal spaces. According to many education researchers, the content of our curriculum becomes knowledge for students only when they are able to infuse it with meaning. But for too many of our students, the message that they may be receiving from us as arts educators is that some of the genres associated with our respective arts areas that interest them and their ways of engaging with those genres have no place in the arts education curriculum. Christopher Small described a hidden logical chain in some music practice that might suffice here as an example of what I'm talking about. And as I explain this, it's helpful to understand that in a logical chain, the conclusion is assumed to be true if each preceding step in the chain is true. So here's Christopher Small's hidden logical chain. The first step says, our music, which may be classical music, marching band music, show band music, choral music, big band, but is rarely improvised or self-composed music because that's difficult to control. This is the only real music, the music that's in parentheses. The next step in the chain says, you don't like or you aren't proficient in or aren't interested in our music, the music that's in parentheses, therefore you are not musical. The logical fallacy lies in the original premise that those styles and genres of music in parentheses are the only real music, which then obviously invalidates the remaining assumptions. If we substitute visual art, dance, or drama and theater for music, and if the genres of those art forms that we place in parentheses that are supposed to represent our arts education program are as limited as the ones listed for music, then we've created the same logical fallacy, a fallacy which can serve to include some students, but definitely exclude others. Another important aspect of making program and curricular choices that are responsive to culture is expanding our notion of what it means to be artistically literate. I took a definition from the National Coalition for Core Arts Standards. And this definition, the part that I focused in on was the fact that artistic literacy is knowledge and understanding required to participate authentically in the arts. And that word authentically to me is very important, because being authentic to me has lots of meanings. Some of it has to do with being able to accurately replicate certain ways of engaging with an arts area. But it also, I think, points to the importance of how different people engage with an arts area as a means of personal expression, as a means of becoming who they authentically are. And so I think when if we think back to the fill in the blank exercise that we did earlier, I said that the statements are based on Western European notions of excellence in an arts discipline. So this is associated as well with our notions of what make people literate in a given arts area. It not only reflects what we establish as worthy of knowing, but it also places certain values on ways of engaging with an art form over others, even when that preferred or more valued way can sometimes be antithetical to the art form itself. And by that, I mean, tend to think in terms of music. We, for example, talk in music about the importance of rote before note and sound before symbol, and yet we tend to spend a great deal of time, perhaps even too early, having students read notation. Now, this music is an oral art, but I think that if we try to present notation to students too early, then they become notationally oriented and visually oriented. And so instead of spending time and letting them develop their ears so that they can bring meaning to the notation when they finally encounter it, we give it to them too early, and we demand that they pull meaning out of it before the meaning has been established. So that's what I mean about having some approaches to teaching art forms that are kind of antithetical to the form itself. A few strategies that you can apply to make your program and curriculum choices more responsive to culture include capitalizing on the artistic expertise in your community and inviting culture bearers into your classrooms and rehearsal spaces. Often talking to faculty, staff, and other colleagues, talking with your students and their family members, or visiting local businesses related to your discipline and community centers can lead to valuable community connections. You can broaden your perspective by making a point of viewing media or attending community events that feature facets of your artistic specialty that are outside of your area of expertise, and trying to identify the unique characteristics of these performances, presentations, and exhibitions. Take notes about the similarities and differences between what you see, hear, encounter, or feel, and what you're working on with your students. And consider ways you can use these experiences to make deeper connections with your students. Be aware of how the language used in discussing your arts discipline can sometimes be laden with some value assumptions. Describing and evaluating facets of an art form using terms like ugly or beautiful, in tune or out of tune, musical or unmusical, primitive, unsophisticated, or even serious can often reflect aesthetic biases. When we reference some styles or genres of art forms as being in addition to or extra in relationship to a core arts curriculum, we're also contributing to the exclusion of those forms as an integral part of our curriculum. So in conclusion, I'd like to offer that the key is a powerful metaphor for the teaching and learning process. If understanding is the key that unlocks the door to knowledge, then we must remember that not every door can be opened with the same key. Culturally responsive teaching takes into account the many ways of knowing that our students bring to our instructional settings, and it ensures that students have the special keys they need to open their own doors. I hope that this presentation has given you some things to think about and that you'll begin to investigate culturally responsive teaching more deeply in terms of how it can transform your teaching and your students' learning in such a way that they can truly see themselves reflected in your respective arts education programs. So thank you so much for your attention today. I'm going to leave this up just for a few seconds. You might be able to take a shot of this with your phone. There's a link there. There's also a QR code. So if you have a QR code reader, you should be able to access the handout for this presentation. But if any of you do have problems accessing it, you can just email me at clmckoy@uncg.edu. Just a couple more seconds and I'll stop screen sharing.
This was amazing. Thank you so much. I want to know that this is work that we are going to continue. This is not a one-off. Connie, you've given us a good foundation to begin with, and we have a lot of work to do. Thank you so much for making time out of your day today. Really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
So I'm just going to do a couple of housekeeping things, and I know you can't see the chat, but there's a lot of thank yous coming through here. There's a lot of gratitude.
I can see it now. I'm back with you. Once I stop screen share, I can see everything.
Oh, I know exactly what you were looking at. Yeah. Okay,
yeah.
I know now. Okay. So yeah, there's a lot of thanks coming in, and she can see now. So put your comment in the chat. So tell you what, we're gonna make sure that everyone has a chance to get up and move around and use the restroom and all that kind of stuff. So our breakout sessions are going to start at 9:55. 9:55, and conversations that were started this morning are going to continue in your breakout for disciplines. So make sure you're choosing your right discipline and going into that. And then our teacher's lounge at 12:15, we also have broken it into 4 rooms. There's going to be one on, I've lost my sticky here, on SOS technology, one on best synchronous learning practices for pre-K folks, and another one I'll be in with just kind of other. I want you to know that there is a thread that's coined by the district as culturally sustaining practices in ethnic studies. There is a lot of opportunities the district will be providing over the next 2 weeks that you can take more professional development around these topics. And Fennell and I are going to be doing a session in this thread specific to VAPA as well. So this is the start of a conversation. Connie has put her, or maybe Ethan did that, but her email address is up on the top of the chat, pinned at the top. So you have that as well. So we will now take our break for 15 minutes. Again, thank you, Connie. Thank you, everyone, for being here this morning, and enjoy the rest of your morning.